Hey, deserving listeners, it's that time of year again where I get a chance to answer all your emails. I'm trying to do that at the end of the year here, beginning of the year. So let's get to it. This first email is from Abby from Finger Lakes, New York. She sent me an email. She said a number of things in the email, but one of the things that she said was she says she often will carry with her my 10 things that I often will say. And she listed them off. And they were like a bullet pointed list of things that I frequently will talk about and little notions or advices that I will give out. And when I read this list, it was so weird to see a list of my belief system in a summarized form listed back to me. Because for me, I'm just sort of yammering and talking about all sorts of things, and I've never really sat down and listed the foundation of my approach or how I see things. I mean, I certainly can summarize in an academic, clinical way my theory, if you will, my integrative theory. But that doesn't really encapsulate the themes that I think I often talk about, because when I read this bullet-pointed list, it wasn't really tied to any kind of theory. It was just these things that I often will recommend people think about and will give advice about. And so it got me thinking about, like, what are these things that I'm frequently talking about? Because if I just thought about things that I try to push and talk about, it probably wouldn't align with the actual things that I yammer about most often. It's sort of like when people will watch videos of mine and they will say, you should have a merch. You should have a t-shirt that says this thing that you frequently say. And suddenly I realize, I say that phrase a lot. And I didn't even notice that, right? So it was sort of like that. So I asked Abby if she could provide a more elaborate list, because the first list she sent was kind of brief. And so she sent an more elaborate list. And so I actually took that list and kind of rearranged it into some themes. And so I thought I would go over that and let's see if this sort of pans out. And maybe y'all could think about for yourself what you think of as sort of the foundation of different advices that you might give other people, that kind of. Okay. So the first category that Abby pointed out was what I would call relational traumas and schemas. So things related to past relationships, often our childhood relationships, and how that negative experiences growing up will cause us to develop defenses and schemas. And she, I'm sort of paraphrasing what she wrote here, but there are a lot of sub-bullet points to this area. And of course that makes sense, because that I am often talking about. It's very core to the way I see the world. Whenever anything happens with a friend or my wife or myself or my family or anything, or even in the news, if there's a politician, I always, the first thought I have is like with Putin, for example, I just wonder what sort of childhood he went through that caused him to develop this distorted way of seeing the world that causes so much destruction, And I don't know, obviously, and I can't know. But anyway, so the sub-bullet points here are: abuse and neglect at an early age causes people to develop internal beliefs about themselves and the world, and the world that are distorted. Yeah, absolutely. So, difficulties growing up, early age, cause people to develop belief systems about themselves and the world, and these beliefs are often distorted. They see the self and the world through a distorted lens. People have schemas that distort how they see and understand the world. Yeah. Often they are not even aware that what they believe doesn't make sense to others. Nobody wakes up and decides they are going to try to ruin someone's day. Yeah, so when she wrote that one, I was like, yeah, I do say that a lot. I often will say a phrase like, well, no one wakes up, or very few people wake up in the morning and decide that they're going to ruin their life or they're going to ruin their marriage. It's not something that they do on purpose. They're responsible for their behavior, of course, but their distortions, their schemas, result in them taking action or interpreting things in such a way that actually it does destroy their life or their marriage or other people, but that's not what they're intending on doing. Sometimes people behave badly or dramatically because that is how they learned to get attention when they were very young. They would rather get bad attention than no attention at all. Yeah, that's certainly not my idea, but it's something that I sometimes will talk about in the reaction videos that I make. Another bullet point here: overfunctioner, underfunctioner relationships. Underfunctioners believe that they are not capable of actually being competent in making decisions, so they rely on the overfunctioner even more. Yeah, so if you don't watch my reaction videos, you probably don't hear me talking about overfunctioner, underfunctioner very often, but in the reaction videos, it doesn't come up a lot, but it comes up more because in these relationships, I think reality TV tends to enjoy casting overfunction or underfunctional relationships because they know that it plays well to the audience, causes an emotional reaction in the audience. Traumas don't have to be what we traditionally think of trauma, like an accident or a death. They can be small things that build over time, like criticism. Yeah. Triggers are not always obvious, like fireworks with a combat veteran. They can be reminders of events. Yeah. So, triggers to essentially this bullet point here, triggers to trauma can be subtle things like just someone asking you to do a favor for them can actually trigger a trauma for you. Yeah. People criticize or say hurtful things or put someone down because they are insecure about an aspect of themselves. They may feel threatened or uncomfortable around you, and they want to get rid of that feeling. Sometimes if they make you feel bad, they feel better. Yeah. So again, on these reality TV shows, there's a lot of people being critical or being hurtful or doing hurtful things. And it's confusing. You're just like, why would you do that to the person you love? And the common narrative online and in society is that these people are psychopaths, sociopaths, as they'll call them, or, malignant narcissists. And certainly that can be the case. I can't know with these individuals, but that's not usually the case. Usually it's because they are distorted, they're hurt, they are insecure, they're doing everything they can to try to figure out a way to feel a little bit better about themselves. And so, they'll resort to a lot of different things to get there. Okay, so those are all sub-bullet points in the larger bullet point that I'm often talking about that I titled Relational Traumas and Schemas. The next bullet point is just a short one, and it says, make sure to say to people, I'm sorry you went through that. How did that make you feel? And Abby says that this one has changed my life, ! Yeah, so I don't know if I think Abby might be a person who watches my videos because I feel like there's a different sort of yammerings that I will frequently say in the reaction videos that I make as opposed to the podcast. But somewhere along the line, I am frequently talking about things that you can say to people when they're going through a difficult situation. They're grieving or they are having a medical issue or something. And there's this compulsion or this cultural notion that you're supposed to say a certain thing or you're just supposed to avoid it altogether or something, and or you're supposed to fix it, for example. And this isn't my idea, but I'm frequently talking about it, that just attend to them. And it's hard to know exactly what to say because it's case by case, but a common thing you might be able to say is just say, hey, oh my God, I'm so sorry you went through that. How do you feel right now? How you doing? It's not complicated. And if you do it sincerely, then it'll be often received very well, as opposed to avoiding or trying to fix or making it about you or getting anxious or trying to push a silver lining on the other person. Another thing that I will do myself sometimes or recommend is to just tell someone, oh my God, I don't know what to say to that. I want to help, but of course that's stupid. I don't, what you're going through. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry that you went through that. Just be real. And, but the key is you don't want to act like it's not a big deal. You don't want to act like it can be solved with a simple problem. You don't want to mansplain to someone. You want to be there for them, make them, what would you want to hear in a situation like that kind of thing. All right, the next bullet point has a lot of sub-bullet points, and this I titled the conflict area. I'm frequently talking about conflict, how it arises, how to manage it. Some bullet points here. Share how something made you feel instead of getting angry or upset. It gives the other person an opening to understand and have a constructive dialogue. Just chiming in here. Yeah, again, I think this is more a reaction video thing that I'm frequently yammering about, but is instead of transforming your hurt into, or your fear into anger and hostility or rejection or withdrawing, stick with the core feeling, stick with the fear, stick with the hurt. Your partner, your romantic partner, your spouse is cold and distant recently and is seemingly giving you the cold shoulder. You don't really know why, or maybe you know why. And there's an impulse often for us in a situation like that to pull away as well, to be like, well, if you're not going to talk to me, I'm not going to talk to you. And that's a passive aggression. It's hostile. It's giving the silent treatment. Or to go to them and say, I can't believe that you're treating me like shit lately, that kind of thing. Or you're such a heartless person or something. Or to go to your friends and say, like, my partner is a complete asshole, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of other things. Or you go to your partner and say, like, you have a problem. Like, let me help you with your problem that you withdraw so often, that kind of thing. Instead of, and all those things are secondary, tertiary reactions to the core initial response, emotional response, which is hurt feelings of being rejected and fear of losing the relationship, fear of rejection, hurt of current rejection, and fear of further rejection down the line. So it's pain, hurt, fear, anxiety. And if you just go to your partner and you communicate those feelings in a non-accusatory, non-hostile manner, then it gives your partner a chance to rise to the occasion, as I often will say. But your partner may or may not rise to the occasion. It doesn't guarantee it, of course, but it's much more likely, especially if you do this habitually, because the first few, because what I'll get when I work with clients on this, they'll go to their partner, we say it's individual therapy, they go to their partner and they speak about primary emotions, and they say, the other day you hurt my feelings, and I'm not angry at you. It just kind of hurt my feelings. The first couple times you do that with your partner, it's possible that your partner will not hear what you're actually saying, because usually when you bring up things like this, it turns into a fight. And so the things you're saying, even though you're saying it in a non-hostile, non-aggressive, non-accusatory manner, they interpret it as such because you've never done it otherwise. And so it takes a while to break the habit, the routine of the fight. And so you got to stick with it, is the point. Because, clients will come back to me and say, I talked about my primary emotions with my partner, and they still didn't respond well. They still rejected me and this sort of thing. And, this is why couple therapy is so much more effective in a situation like this, because I can actually engineer the conversation. I can be there for it, because there's no guarantee that my client goes home and actually does what I'm recommending. Yeah, so when we stick to those primary emotions of fear and hurt, and we do so in a non-accusatory way, it can solve so many problems. Even among nations, if going back to Putin, and I've talked about this before, but I'm guessing that Putin is afraid of invasion, or afraid of being irrelevant, or afraid of his supposed enemies. And that is the analysis, that he is invading Ukraine because he doesn't want NATO to be at his doorstep. Russia, USSR often had a buffer. They, over history, over millennia, over centuries, because their country is so large, when they were invaded and harmed during World War II by Germany primarily, they relied on land to give them a buffer between the enemy and themselves, so they could retreat. They could give up Moscow if they needed to. They could give up whole swaths of land, but as long as they had a buffer zone, they could always rebuild and fight back and survive. And when NATO, and Putin sees NATO as a threat, instead of coming to NATO and the Western world and say, it scares me that you're doing this, and I lie awake at night worrying that you're going to invade, or you're going to impose your military might on me, and we're not the superpower that we used to be, and I'm afraid that you're going to harm us because of things we've done in the past or our ideological differences or something. And so I'm just afraid. And then if Putin were to be able to say that, which I believe to be the primary emotion, the Western world hopefully would rise to the occasion and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry that you're feeling that way. That's not our intention. Maybe there's another arrangement that we could work out. Maybe we don't need NATO per se. Maybe we just all work together. Or you could be a member of NATO, Russia. If you just follow these guidelines of human rights and other kinds of agreements and treaties, maybe we can all be friends. There's no reason why we have to be at odds with each other. We don't inherently want to eliminate you. NATO would say the only reason why we have NATO and the only reason why we expand NATO is because we're afraid of people like you because of things you've done in the past. So if you're saying you're afraid and we're afraid, how about we just work together as a team? Okay. Just imagine, people out there, if nations could do that throughout history, going back, thousands of years. How many innocent lives would be saved because of that? And it sounds absurd, right? But it's not. It's humanly possible for the leader of a militaristic nation to have self-awareness and to care about the lives of their own country, people, their citizens, because, thousands of Russians have died and will continue to die because of this. Presumably, Putin and his government, care about that. Hopefully, I don't know. And so it sounds absurd, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm sure that has happened before. I'm sure that, I don't have an example that comes to mind, but I'm sure that there have been nations that have been more mature and been more aware and been more constructive regarding this notion that we're more often talking about in marriages, to talk about our fears first, to talk about our hurts first, to trust the other to rise to the occasion, and also to help other, going between NATO and Russia, one of the things that we could have done differently, I don't know all the ins and outs of this, of course, because there's back channel communication anyway, and I'm not a scholar on this, but NATO could have, as they were expanding to Ukraine and other places, they could have gone to Putin and said, look, by the way, we're expanding, but this isn't a threat to you. We don't actually, if this worries you, let's talk, because we're not here to scare you. This isn't some provocation. We don't have larger machinations of taking you over. That's not our mission here. We're just kind of worried about things going back to the way things were during the Cold War or World War II, and there's just a lot of anxiety. So let's talk, and maybe there's a deal that we could strike so that you don't have. So maybe Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO, but you also don't do the following things, like give Crimea back and stop making threats about Ukraine. We can compromise here, because we don't want Ukraine per se. We just don't want war. We don't want people to invade other countries, because it's scary. There's just a lot of bad things that happen from that. So along those lines, in your marriage, you could go to your partner and just say, like, hey, if you ever want to tell me how I've hurt your feelings or how I'm scaring you or making you feel rejected, please tell me, because I care and I'm open to that. And you can trust me to rise to the occasion. You don't have to veil those things or stuff those things or transform those things into anger or something, Anyway, so getting back to Abby's list, obviously you've heard me yammer about that. So, that's one of the things. Other sub bullet points here. Most emotional and behavioral problems come down to pain and fear. Yeah, there we go. Avoid talking in absolute terms and accept that you may be wrong. Be flexible and humble in order to cool down a difficult conversation. Triangulation is, Abby actually said, triangulation, exclamation point. Again, I probably talk about this more often in the reaction videos, but that how anxiety moves through the system and how a third party will be sucked in and they'll volunteer, that kind of thing. Other bullet points. If someone needs to leave during a tense discussion, it is because of their fight or flight response. Demanding that they stay in the conversation will only make the situation worse. Will only make the situation worse. Never prevent someone from leaving. That is abusive. Yeah. So I'm positive that this is talked about way more in the reaction videos, but not often, but sometimes in the reaction videos, there'll be a conflict and things will be escalating, and one person will want to get away for whatever reason. They're just like, I'm done with this conversation, and they'll walk away. And the other partner will sometimes prevent them from leaving or grab their arm or something. And I'll always stop the video and say, no, 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 no. If someone wants to leave the conversation and you stop them, that's imprisonment. It could be considered criminal. At the very least, it will potentially escalate. I mean, putting hands on in a situation like that, because if I'm in a huge fight with my wife, which would be horrible, and I don't know if this ever happened, but if I were to be, and I was just like, well, let's reverse it, for emphasis on gender. My wife's like, okay, I'm done, I'm out of here. And she's like wanting to walk out the door, and I stand in her way. Well, and she's really fight or flighting in this moment. She has every right to push me out of the way. She has every right to be like, get out of my fucking way or I'm going to push you. And then if I don't move, she has every right to push me. I'm not recommending that, of course, but if you bar someone's exit, not okay. There are very rare circumstances where that would be considered okay. Like if they pick up your child and are about to throw the child out the window, obviously you can bar their exit. But if they're just wanting to walk out of the room or get in their car and drive away or hang up on you or disconnect from you somehow, like you have no right to stop them from doing that. You can absolutely ask them not to. Now, there's a very minor asterisk to this, which is that if you ever do want to leave a conversation like this, if you want things to go well in your relationship, it's best to tell the person, look, I just need a break for 5 minutes or an hour or whatever, and we'll come back and talk. Because often the person who leaves is more on the avoidant side of things, and the person who is not leaving is more on the preoccupied thing. So if the avoidant person is always leaving, it can really trigger the preoccupied person and really cause them to downward spiral. So if you're an avoidant person and you tend to leave in conflict, tell your partner that you're willing to talk about it later, you think, maybe even tomorrow or something. Because if you tell them that the preoccupied person is more likely to relax a little bit. The best thing you can say, if you can muster it, is if you're leaving, is to be like, hey, so I want to take a break from this conversation. I want to have it. I want to continue this conversation, but for my own sake, because I'm starting to, lose control of myself or something. I just want to cool down for a second. Maybe it'll be half an hour, maybe a couple hours, but I love you and I don't want to leave you. In fact, because I don't want to leave you, I feel like a break would actually help me be able to talk about this more in the future. So, give me 30 minutes to just walk around the block or something, and then we can talk about it again. Is that okay? So if you say something like that, that will give the preoccupied person or your partner the best chance of being able to calmly, quote unquote, allow you to separate in that situation. It's really hard to do that because often the avoidant person, when they're fleeing, are having massive amounts of stress and high intensity emotions. So it's hard to differentiate and say those things. But if you can manage anything close to that, that's the recommendation. But yeah, so that's one of the points that I often will bring up. Other bullet points: reaching out and touching your partner or loved one during a tense time can calm the situation. Yeah, I will, again, in the videos, we'll often see that. When I see it, I'll comment on it because very few people will do this, even on these reality TV shows. And it's such a wonderful, when I see that on my couch with the couples that I work with, the families that I work with, where they're in a tense situation and they reach out to each other physically. They hold hands or hand on shoulder, or they sit close to each other, shoulder to shoulder. And this kind of behavior can really mitigate a lot of the bad feelings and the conflict. We're biological creatures, obviously, and when we do this, it changes our biologies. When we have warm, nurturing contact with the people we love, even in the midst of conflict. It can change our blood pressure, our cortisol, our oxytocin, and these sorts of things are protective factors to having the the conflict go off the rails. And the last bullet point here, instead of getting frustrated with someone with negative internal beliefs, give genuine compliments, encourage them, and frequently point out their good qualities. Ask them to talk about things they are proud of. Yeah. All right, so let's take a break. When we get back, I will continue with the bullet point list. All right, we're back from the break. Okay, so I recorded a whole segment here talking about various different things, and later in the day it was bothering me, so I'm going to erase it and record this. Basically, in this section that I'm recording over, I was asking y'all if you're not a patron or you're not currently a patron now, maybe you were in the past and you wanted to become one, that, I encourage you to do so by going to patreon.com. And I went on this long, sort of off-the-cuff, spontaneous discussion of my anxieties regarding the business model of this podcast and the finances and stuff. And I was totally meandering and yammering and going in circles. And so I thought I would, and then at the very end, I sort of came to this summary. So I thought I would just erase the whole thing and just say the summary, which is this: that one, everything's fine financially. There's not a problem. Two, a good portion of the business model of this podcast depends on patrons, on people signing up to become patrons. And every month there's an attrition. There's people who will cancel their membership on Patreon, which is fine. And there's usually, in the past 8 or 7 years that I've been on Patreon, there's at least as many people signing up. So at least we're breaking even every month. And so I can sort of plan for the future based on that kind of thing. And over the past couple of years, I've been growing the podcast and doing more things and hiring people and paying the co-hosts and whatnot, and investing in better equipment and video stuff and blah, blah, blah. And so I, have been feeling fine and everything's fine. But in the past 6 months, there has been, I won't go into detail, but, there's been a decline in terms of the patron situation. And at first I wondered if it actually had to do with the trial, because that was a pretty controversial time for the podcast. But upon talking to people who canceled their membership, because there's a survey that goes out to everyone who cancels their membership on Patreon, and I've also talked with some people, and of course, there's a wide variety of reasons as to why someone would cancel, and of course, I can't necessarily guarantee that everyone would tell me the truth, but generally speaking, the 99% of people are just like, well, one, I'm not listening to the podcast as much anymore, and two, I just can't afford it. I'm paying for Netflix and I'm paying for all these other things, and I just can't pay for these things all the time. And so, it's just normal stuff, and a big reason as to why I cancel memberships or subscriptions. So it all just seemed normal. The other thing I think possibly is the reason is that the economy isn't as good, that there's a lot of worries about the future and inflation and gas prices going up and all this kind of stuff. And I think that is also normal. And I'm old enough to remember when we had this huge economic crash in 2008, and I was a self-employed person back then too, and noticed how my business was really struggling during that time. But, there was always a bounce back, and there was in 2009. My business not only recovered, but did really well, my private practice. Anyway, so the conclusion, after meandering for a while, is that everything's fine, number one. Two, the main thing that I wondered about is that if any of you are like, well, yeah, I'll become a patron, but he seems to have enough patrons that he doesn't need any more, so why would I become a patron? I'm here to tell you that that's not true. I'm not like kicking back and going like, oh my God, everything's fine. Like every month it's I obsess on certain things, and I look at various different statistics to make, because, I'm self-employed, and my family depends on me, and, Stacy doesn't really work that much anymore, and she works a lot for the podcast. So, my entire kind of family situation is dependent on, and that's my fault. You could say, well, Kirk, you should have done that, and okay, well, fine, and maybe you're right. But I don't know. I want to do this all the time. I want to do podcasting and YouTube stuff all the time, full time, and I have been. And so anyway, point is that if you were thinking about becoming a patron and you're like, I'm not, because he already has enough patrons, I want to dispel you of that myth. That's just not the case. But returning back to number one, everything's fine. Like legit, everything's fine. If things continue on the current sort of trend, which, I would guess it won't. But again, everything's fine. Don't worry, and don't, and some of you care a lot about me and you don't want me to suffer. And so I don't want to inject anxiety into your life. There's zero to worry about. Stacy isn't worried. I'm the only one that worries because I just am kind of like that. And so that's all I have to say. And believe it or not, this yammering was shorter and more concise than the previous time I recorded it. All right, so stopping recording and sort of picking up where I left off earlier. So this next bullet point is the word pathological. So Abby was saying that pathological optimist. So I will often use the term pathological to refer to people when they have a problem that hurts themselves or hurts others. So you can be a pathological optimist, for example, as Abby points out. I will sometimes talk about that because one's optimism is actually causing issues. They're imposing optimism, and as a result, it causes people to feel like they're not being heard. Like you're telling your partner, well, like me, I tell my wife that I'm worried about the patron count, and every time I say it, she's always like, "Oh, things will work out. Everything will be fine." This sort of optimism, this incessant pathological optimism. My wife isn't like this, but if she were, it will make me feel discounted. It'll make me feel like, how do you know that? And two, that's not what I want to hear right now. What I want to hear right now is that you care and that you understand how I feel, that my feelings are valid. You can certainly, say, like, my wife could say something like, yeah, I could see that you'd be scared about that. Is there anything that we can do to change that? Or, do you want to talk about it? And then after we do that, she might say, tell you the truth, I'm not personally worried because of the following reasons. I think that things will work out in the end because they usually do, but, I don't want to discount your feelings right now. There's a way of expressing optimism, because I feel like a lot of times when people are optimistic, they're scared themselves and they're trying to alleviate that fear in themselves and in their partners, their the other, by just forcing optimism down the other person's throat, And so there's a more delicate way, more diplomatic way, a more caring way to take care of someone with one's optimism, with one's optimistic perspective, All right, the next bullet point, sort of category, is abuse, the topic of abuse. And Abby writes here, it's okay to empathize with people who act badly because of trauma, but it doesn't mean you have to put up with their bad behavior. Yeah, so I learned this a long time ago. No, well, kind of not a long time ago, but kind of a few years ago, that for me, when I'm talking about abusive behavior, people who commit abusive behavior, I'm not always, but I'll often try to figure out what was the pathway for that individual to become abusive, to commit that abusive behavior. And sometimes the person is a psychopath and what we might call quote unquote evil, meaning that they intend or get off on harming other people. And it's, there's really no other reason besides that. But most people who are abusive are doing so, in my view, because of their own traumas that they've been through and the defenses they had to develop when they were young. Doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And often I would just sort of end the analysis there, the conceptualization there, because I didn't know that people, upon hearing me say that, they would interpret that to mean that because one might have a compassionate, more accurate conceptualization of their abusive partner, they thus have to put up with the abuse. You know what I mean? I don't know if you can hear a plane going overhead. I have the windows open because it's so warm in Seattle right now. It's really weird. It was like super cold. Now it's like super warm. I mean, not super warm, but warmer. Anyway, so people would say to me, well, okay, you've helped me to understand my abusive partner better, but what if I don't want to stay in the relationship? And I'll say like, well, those things are not connected. In fact, they might even help you to leave someone, right? Now that you've given me a compassionate view of my partner, it would be mean of me, and I would be re-abusing my partner by leaving them, because that would give them more reason to have this abusive defense, right? And thus I have to stay in this abusive relationship. And then I would say, no. But it does not mean that. They're completely disconnected things. I mean, they could be related, I suppose. Like if I were in a relationship with an abusive person and I was convinced or was able to see them in a way that provided some compassion towards the abusive person, I'm just like, well, I get why he's abusive to me, because when he was young, he was abused and da-da-da. And I guess that could help me to stay in the relationship, so that I might go to him and say like, look, I know you're not meaning to be abusive of me, but you are. And I think it's because of your abusive history in your childhood. And so maybe you could get some help for that. And I'll give you some time to do that. But if you don't stop being abusive, I'm going to leave you, something like that, maybe. But what I will say to people when they bring this up is, for me personally, once I can see the abuse for what it is and conceptualize it, as I often do, in a more compassionate way, the end result for me is I am motivated to leave that person. Unless I can predict with high probability that this individual will change soon, like they are very aware of their abusive behavior, they're getting help for it, they've apologized to me up and down, da-da-da, which almost never happens, by the way. If I heard that, then maybe I would stay with them, but maybe not. So the vast majority of the time when I have identified an abusive person in my life, often with help from my own therapist, and then I have a compassionate view, I will go on a campaign to leave that person, whether it means that I cut them off right away, or I go on a slow campaign of gray rocking myself away from that person. Life is too short, and I'm not going to put up with that shit, and I don't deserve to be abused, and I don't care why they're abusive. I just know that they're abusing me, and that's bullshit, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And if I leave them and it causes them to have more reason to be abusive in the future, that is not my fucking fault. And I am not everyone's savior, and I'm not everyone's therapist. That's not my responsibility, and fuck that shit. I'm out. All right, let's take a break. We get back. Let's read some more of these bullet points. Actually, let's make the rest of it for patrons only. So the rest of this episode will just be for patrons, and I'm just going to finish the list. I think I'm about halfway through the list. It's kind of interesting. Again, super interesting to go over this list by Abby, to have her reflect back to me these frequent things that I say, And when I read these bullet points, I'm like, yeah, and another thing. So obviously I'm passionate about each one of these things. All right. So if you want to hear the rest of the episode, become a patron by going to patreon.com, but only if you want to. Do not feel pressured. Please, but only if you want to. But if you want to, and you want to, then please.